Hey all, so we're back for the fifth, we're getting close to the end, installment of this series on essential champions for Alliance War offense. Here, obviously, we have the skill class. This is kind of an odd one and maybe a little controversial because, in my opinion, skill is not really as differentiated as the other classes. And so my conclusion here is less that you need specific champions a lot of the times, and more that you need to make sure you have certain kinds of utility covered. And those four big pieces of utility that I think you will usually be leaning on your skill champions for are some kind of evade or auto block counter. Sometimes it's generalized ability accuracy reduction, but often specifically at least that. You're looking for some kind of debuff control, usually in the form of shrugging. You're looking for serious damage. This is a DPS class, often in the form of damage over time, but not always. And you are looking for ways to get openings in on the opponent that you otherwise might not have. These are kind of the four things that all of the best skill champions have at least three out of. So, not going to bury the lead here. I'm just going to give the list of my tier 1 champions here. I would put Nick, Shang-Chi, Kingpin, Moleman, Killmonger, Elsa Bloodstone, and Falcon in this tier. And I imagine there are going to be some strong reactions to a few of those, but hopefully you'll understand where I'm coming from as I go through these. So we're starting off with Nick Fury, who I think is probably the most popular choice for best skill champion, and by a decent margin. I mentioned when I was talking about Doom that I thought his kit was really well put together, but I felt like his base stats were a little bit high and he just felt overtuned. Honestly, that's kind of what I feel like with Fury. The kit is awesome. I don't necessarily want him to lose any abilities, but the fact that he has everything he has and his level of damage output seems a little nuts to me sometimes. But that's really neither here nor there. The important thing is that going down our list here, he can counter evade and auto block, and he can actually also counter miss. You just have to keep his charges up, and there are various ways of doing that. He does have debuff control because when he knocks down the opponent, he purifies non-damaging debuffs on himself, and provided you have him awakened, which you probably do if you're using him in war, if you run out of the health on that first life and you trigger his decoy, then when he heals back to full before degenning, he's going to purify all effects on himself. And then as far as easy openings, he can go unblockable. Who needs to find openings if anytime the opponent blocks you can just waltz right in and combo? He really checks all of the boxes, and he does so in a very powerful way. I think Decoy Nick is probably somewhat underrated. I've talked to a lot of people who think that he's not worth using unless you kill him off and get to real Nick and just operate at 30% health. I don't agree, and more importantly, most of the players that I really respect who use Nick on a regular basis also do not agree. But the fact that he has most of this utility in both forms and just has even better access to it when mistakes are made and goes stun immune, which is kind of a nice little bit of tankiness that's special to him, and is itself a form of debuff control, remember, because stuns are usually debuffs, it's easy to see why he's a favorite. So, moving on to my personal favorite, like I said, these are not in order. I'm not coming for any one listed after this. My personal favorite skill champion is Killmonger. And if you are watching this, there's a decent chance that you have already seen some of my other videos and you know this. He is a workhorse for me. I had multiple fights this past season where I took 5 fights with him. He is really fantastic. I also have a guide on him that I will link in the description if you're not really seeing it with his kit. But just to go over the points we talked about here, he has that evade and auto block counter because he has really solid access to True Strike, and he has one of the best methods of upkeeping it in my personal opinion. Because as I've said before, With many champions, they get something like True Strike. This is a problem with Karnak, who just got buffed. And then you're baiting out the opponent's special, and oops, it's gone. Because Killmonger gets his True Strike by punishing the opponent's special, when they finally throw it, he gets it back. And that's a really powerful ability. As far as debuff control goes, he only has access to shrugging via the Void synergy, and it's not the most reliable mechanic, so I would never take him into something like Hazard Shift, but he gains power when inflicted with debuffs, and that can very much come in handy, and it does help him close out some of those fights with the less annoying debuffs more quickly. Damage is the usual knock against him, but especially if you have him duped, his damage is respectable even without the special 3. True Strike is itself a damage buff because he's not just bypassing evade and auto block, he's ignoring armor and physical resistance. And he does have those bleeds, and he is one of the best for finding good openings because by using his counterpunch charges, you can get not only openings for combos, but even intercepts for the nodes where that matters. And if you have his indestructible charges up as well, you take no damage in getting those openings. So even if the opponent has a very high attack value, or there's some kind of block penetration at play, he can even get around that. Additionally, he is one of the tankier skill champs. He is, I believe, the only skill champ with crit resistance, and he has solid armor as well. He doesn't have to be your personal favorite, but he absolutely checks all the boxes and very much gets the job done as a top-tier skill champ. So then we have Kingpin, who I think is still underrated as an attacker. There are a few rank 4 6-star Kingpins floating around, and I've seen a couple reactions to them along the lines of, oh, you know what, that's probably pretty solid on defense. But this beefy boy is an attacker. He actually does not really cover the evade auto block part that I mentioned, not unless you bring a synergy for him, or if you're relying on the relatively weak ability accuracy reduction in his special ones debuff, but he fits the other boxes so well that it doesn't really matter in my opinion. So debuff control, he can turn all debuffs into his personal rage debuffs. He does this decently on his own, but often you're going to be running him with Hood if you're bringing him into war, which takes it up to 100% chance and makes him, out of all of the champions listed here, the single best counter to something like Hazard Shift, where there are just a ton of debuffs, and you can't have even a few stick. Additionally, in terms of damage, all of those debuffs he's converting are then contributing to his attack rating, and even if you don't have a lot of debuffs, he just generally hits pretty hard, especially once you get up to the special 2, throw that, and go into his overpower. In terms of openings, he has that unstoppable on his heavy, he has the long unstoppable on his special 2. He's very, very good. If you are not fully convinced on Kingpin, I'm going to link MU8's channel, Bryce, in the description. He's done some really great things with Kingpin, including a solo of the Kang boss in 7.3, and just took his to rank 4, explicitly for war offense. He's been taking bosses, usually with the hazard node, the hazard shift node left up, kind of like when Ghost does it, with Kingpin, and it's been really successful. So if this inclusion surprises you, go check out his channel. The newest one on this list, I think Shang-Chi has the best chance out of any of them at dethroning Nick. He is really, really good. He wasn't used as much as he might have been last season because of the way that Untouchables made slow an active detriment. Not a fan of that design choice, but let's just put it in the corner for now. But otherwise, the kit here is fantastic. Slow itself is an evade counter. It's also an unstoppable counter. He's one of only 2 skill champions with access to slow. As far as his damage goes, it's really respectable, even without building up a ton of chi charges, so you get the YouTube thumbnail levels of Special 2, he can still hit plenty hard, especially if he's awakened and he's doing that extra damage that gets around caps. When it comes to shrugging, he's one of the best here. His cleanse wushu is extremely reliable and fairly easy to cycle. As far as openings go, he kind of has the same take on this that Nick does. He doesn't really have any way to start combos by like intercepting or any of that stuff, but he can go unblockable into a champion's block, and then he can stay unblockable for quite some time. There's your opening. He can also stun into block, which is another way of creating openings. Really strong champion. If you aren't fully convinced on his use in war yet, if he maybe seems a little too complicated or a little too niche, then I've mentioned before MP Blaze for Mr. Negative also has great Shang-Chi content, and I believe J-Nick in SAS, who has really great war videos, has been using him as well. J-Nick actually took Shang-Chi up as his first rank 4. Both of them are really great players and great at explaining, and they show off why this champion is absolutely tier 1. So now we come to Mole Man, and I have to address the giant subterranean lizard man in the room. He is currently bugged. I'm not really interested in a debate over whether you consider it a bug or not, but he is currently functioning in a way that does not line up with his text, the description of his abilities, and it makes him much, much more powerful. The way his kit is spelled out, he is supposed to have access to either true accuracy or guaranteed critical hits, and it is currently possible for him to have access to both halves of that kit at the same time as long as you play it a certain way. I'm not going to go into that, but we just need to acknowledge that the champion we have now may not be the champion that we have forever. Additionally, he is supposed to be able to block unblockable attacks. He's supposed to be able to do that once. I have heard from several people who play him on a regular basis that that is also bugged, and he has access to that multiple times in a row, which obviously also makes him stronger. But I am going to do my best to do him justice, both in his current state and where I believe he should be. Either way, I think he belongs in this tier. He has that evade and auto block counter via his true accuracy, and even if he gets fixed and has to trade it off, it will be possible to maintain it if you play carefully. He has excellent debuff control in his shrugging. Now, once he gets up to that maximum monster mass and goes into frenzy, or if he accidentally activates frenzy earlier than that, he loses the ability to shrug, so I wouldn't necessarily recommend him for nodes like hazard shift or anything like that, unless you are actively planning to go into frenzy and use power back boosts to just nuke something with his special 2. But if you only need to deal with a few debuffs here and there, he absolutely has you covered. As far as damage, we already talked about how he can be used as a nuke. Frenzy in general is a very strong ability. Critical hits themselves ignore a lot of armor and physical resistance, and he also applies bleeds, which ignore both. Guaranteed critical hits are just very strong. We all know what Corvus does. Similar ideas here. They also synergize extremely well with power start and power back boosts, as I already mentioned. And then in terms of easy openings, he has the same basic strength here as Killmonger, in that he can use his monster mass to go unblockable, the same way that Killmonger can use counterpunch charges. There's a lot of overlap between the two of them. Given the fact that Killmonger does not have guaranteed critical hits, and it is currently possible for Mole Man to lose almost nothing and get those, I would say that in his current form, Mole Man is stronger, but I think fixed, they'll be fairly close. I have seen a number of Mole Man fights that go south because the relationship, even in his current form, the relationship between those two sides of his kit is not properly balanced, or you end up building monster mass too high while you're still trying to shrug, and that causes problems. There's a balancing act to this champion, but if you learn how to play him to a high level, he is extremely, extremely good. There are a lot of channels that I could point to for this. Off the top of my head, I'm just going to say that I know Vega has some recent videos on him, so I'll link that in the description. I don't think I really have to convince any of you that he deserves his spot in this list. He is a little bonkers at the moment, but I think he will still deserve his spot in this list, even after fixed. If nothing else, I haven't even mentioned his shock immunity yet, and that's still a relatively rare immunity, and it definitely comes into play in war. There's not only the EMP modification mini-boss, but there are now a couple different nodes that inflict shocks, and several big defenders that do as well. So you definitely want a mole man around. So I'm aware that this next pick is probably my most controversial include in Tier 1, but I really strongly believe that Elsa has earned her spot here. She checks all the boxes the way that I've laid out. She has her evade counter in the fact that once a champion evades her once, then she converts her Hellfire rounds into cold snaps, which just completely turn off evade. She has very good debuff control and just that periodic shrug that you don't have to do anything about of non-damaging debuffs. She definitely has the damage. She hits quite hard, and she does so in a way that gets around a lot of forms of damage mitigation, because she has the direct damage via her Behemoth Busters. She has the damage over time of her Incinerates, even though it's relatively weak. She has very good crits, and she has one of the best ways to create openings in the form of her evade counter. Not only can she do a parry or a well-timed block against a charging opponent, and then start a combo against them without taking any damage on block because she didn't actually block, this also works against unblockable attacks, which do come up on the map sometimes, and she's really the only one on this list besides Shang-Chi with his ability to stun through block that really has an answer to that. I realize that there are a number of people who are probably going to say, okay, but wouldn't you just use one of the others? And often the other champions on this list can be a substitute for Elsa. Or she can be a substitute for them. But remember what I said, the skill class kind of feels like it's in a weird spot where you just need to have your bases covered more than you need specific champions. And there are fights where Elsa is the best option. As we just talked about, on certain nodes, if you end up getting just an absolute ton of debuffs on you to the point where it overloads Shang-Chi's ability to cleanse, or it overloads Mole Man's monster mass and so he stops being able to parify, or if you're not able to knock the opponent down and so Nick can't get around it. On lane 4B, this would mean that other champions would just have debuffs on them and the defender would be unblockable, but Elsa can still combo safely into unblockable champions via her evade counter. Additionally, the fact that she has Incinerate is itself a form of utility. We actually used her on a Polka Dot Power Terrax this season, and in my opinion, she's one of the safest options there. I have seen Claire die, I have seen Cable die, I have seen Namor die. There are other counters for that, but Elsa is seriously one of the cleanest. And I will be linking Campo's video of him taking that specific fight in the description. I will also be linking Rob Hop's channel. He's the leader of my Alliance SSX, and I believe he says that he was the first rank 3 Elsa in the game, and I think he did a fair amount of research to back that up, and he's somewhat the leader of the Church of Elsa at SSX. We have quite a few rank 3s. He uses her a lot in war and does really great things with her, so go check that out. Check out Campo's channel. Hopefully you change your mind a little bit if you're skeptical. And the last one here is kind of the odd man out in Falcon, because he doesn't really have the active debuff control. He doesn't really have the easy opening side of things. He's more damage and evade counter, but he can substitute for those other two with the fact that his evade counter comes in the form of 100% ability accuracy reduction, which can completely turn off defensive abilities and nodes. I've seen him used to get around very tricky stuff this way. A good Falcon player is a big asset. However, that weird way that he comes at this particular utility is itself a little bit of a weakness, because if the defender has any kind of increased ability accuracy in their actual kit or from the node, or is immune to ability accuracy modification, and we see both of these things, both enhanced ability accuracy and force of will, the immunity to ability accuracy modification on the current war map, then Falcon runs into problems. So, where he works, he can be one of the best options because as long as you're comfortable with his playstyle, he just turns things off and hits hard. And that's usually a recipe for success. You just have to be a little careful in planning him because he doesn't work everywhere. So I'm going to take a break here in the middle of this one before moving on to the Tier 2 champions, and just say that I think as far as essential ones go, you really need to make sure that you have at least one good Nick player in your battle group, and you need to make sure you have at least one good Falcon player in your battle group. The other five, Elsa, Killmonger, Mole Man, Shang-Chi, and Kingpin, I think ideally you want somebody with all of them. We currently are in that position where we have all of those available, and I am extremely happy for it. But I think as long as you have some combination out of them, let's say like any three of them available, you'll probably be fine in planning out the map. This is a bit of a deviation from how I've defined essential in the past, where it's like if you don't have this person ranked up, you need them. But I do think that there's a fair amount of substitution between these. If I have to say flat out which one out of Mole Man and Elsa is better in the most situations, I would probably give the nod to Mole Man, especially in his current form, but possibly even in his fixed state. But at the same time, we went a while without any ranked Mole Mans in our battle group, and because we had access to my Killmonger and a few other Elsas in the battle group, we didn't really notice the loss. So it would be kind of weird for me to call Mole Man truly essential, but it would also be stupid to leave him off this list. I don't think there's much debate there, but I also feel like it kind of works the other way too, that I think that Elsa is so useful on the map, that Killmonger is so useful on the map, that Kingpin and Shang-Chi are so useful on the map, that it would be silly to leave them off this first tier, but it's also not true that there are no substitutes for them. And I do think that all of them are legitimately better in different places. Like, leaving Nick out of it, Shang-Chi's version of debuff control is the best out of all of these for something like encroaching stun, because it's instantaneous and you aren't giving the defender a chance to start a combo into you. Elsa's is really, really good when you have spaces in between the debuffs, but you know there's going to be a lot of them over the course of the fight. Mole Man's is really good when you have like a bunch at the beginning and then not as many, or you just need them to be gone quickly, but you know that you're like staying under that cap of 20 so you don't go into frenzy. Even Killmonger's has its place, because there are some times when you don't actually want to get rid of all the debuffs. When I am taking Spider-Ham or Mr. Fantastic with Killmonger, the way that I fight those two, especially on node 55, which is where I have the most fights against them with him, I actually like that I am not shrugging their debuffs because I am constantly healing from them via willpower. They could be causing problems if it were possible for those defenders to evade, but because of True Strike it's not. And then, because of the way that Killmonger processes debuffs and turns them into extra power, the fights are just that much faster because I have all the specials I could possibly want. As I already mentioned, Kingpin is the best one for Hazard Shift because he just turns all of them into extra attack, but he's also the worst for something like Void or 4B because all of those debuffs on him are just going to make the defender go unblockable, or in Void's case, they're just going to mean that he dies. So they all have their specific spots to shine. So as you're taking stock of your battle group, just try to make sure that you have Nick, Falcon, and a few of these others in the hands of people who are really comfortable using them. They all have different play styles. They're going to be more or less effective in the hands of certain players. Figure out what that is, and you'll be set on skill champions. So, skill is also going to be weird in the tier 2 aspect of this because pretty much everyone in tier 2 here I could potentially call unproven because most of these champions at least kind of tick the boxes that I mentioned with some clear limitations, but none of them see regular use in top tier war. So the tier 2 here, I think, is definitely a good step below tier 1 because of all of the overlap that I mentioned in tier 1 and the fact that if you have all of those, you probably have your bases covered anyway. But to go over some of the most promising substitutes if you just do not have access to those tier 1 champions, Jabari is very new and I think mostly used as a defender, but she does kind of check a lot of those boxes. She has some anti-evade, some anti-miss abilities. When she goes into her hunt, she completely turns off both. Her debuff control is really strong. I mentioned that a strength of Shang-Chi's is that his cleanse is instantaneous. She has that as well. Her cleanse charges aren't permanent, unlike his, which I think is a big reason that she's not quite as effective. But theoretically, as long as you're attacking enough, she doesn't have to do anything to reset them. She just has this pretty much all the time and can get rid of, theoretically, all debuffs. So very good there. Her damage is excellent. It's best if the opponent can bleed, but she has access to some pretty solid crits even if they can't. And then when she's duped, she has access to counterpunch charges, same as Killmonger or with Mole Man's Monster Mass, and can get intercepts off of that. It's a little bit harder for her to access those. You're kind of seeing a theme here. It's a little bit harder for her to do all of the things that those tier 1 champions can do, but all of the boxes are checked by what's in her kit, so she theoretically could be very effective. But I think the possible risks are why we haven't seen a lot of her yet. Crossbones is an interesting one because he has access to very high damage, but not damage over time, so a little bit unusual for the skill class. He has very good ability accuracy reduction. He can actually reduce it by more than 100%, which is an advantage over Falcons. And he doesn't crit, which is a very unique ability, mostly not seen outside the tech class. So the fact that he has access to it is itself a strength, because it's coming from a different source with different strengths and weaknesses. Additionally, when he's at high sig, he gets all the way up to a 90% chance to shrug debuffs. Still not 100, but quite good. And as we talked about with Falcon, that ability accuracy reduction can apply to evade and auto block and covers those things. He's a very good champion, but there's maintenance involved in his playstyle. He has a very high ceiling, but basically if the AI in war doesn't play ball, or if something about the node or matchup gets away from you and interferes with his rotation, you might end up in serious trouble very quickly. So he's another one who theoretically covers these bases, but I think there's a real reason we don't see him that often in war. Going along with the theme here, Black Panther has really great debuff shrugging as long as he gets an intercept. He can turn off abilities up to 100% if you have him at maximum sig. He has really great bleed damage, and his moveset is just really good for finding intercepts. It's kind of a funny thing. It's not as strong as like Hercules with Infuriate, although of course if you bring Hercules, he also has Infuriate, and so it gets that much better. But just the way that his animations line up, he's usually pretty good at finding openings through intercepts. So really solid champion, checks all the boxes, but I think the biggest thing is that he doesn't have a whole lot of sustainability, and so if the AI doesn't play ball and you get wrecked going for an intercept, the fight's just kind of over. And additionally, he does require a lot of sig stones. So definitely a tier 2 option. So this next one might actually be the most proven out of these options, and so therefore the truest Tier 2 champion, because I know that B McG, now at DSVG, congrats again on that, has used him a fair bit in war with very good results. He's not a beginner's champion, I don't think. There's a fair amount involved in playing him correctly, and he definitely wants high sig, which again is a big investment for not great prestige. So I don't think he's going to be all that common. But B has done some really good stuff with him. So head over to that channel and check that out if you're curious. He can check most of these boxes. He doesn't really have purification because you're not hoping to be knocked down in war, but he has excellent auto block and evade counters and really, really solid damage. And he's Incinerate immune, which is just a piece of utility that's very unique within the skill class. So then we have Stealth Spidey. I'm mentioning him mainly here because we've talked about how good slow is. Unfortunately, the fact that his access to slow comes at the end of a combo makes it pretty much useless as an evade counter and primarily a thing for unstoppable. He does have decent damage, and you could potentially use his evades to find openings, but I really just think the kid is a bit dated these days and doesn't keep up with the others. We actually assigned a rank 3 Stealth Spidey 2 seasons ago, but then that exact player pulled a Shang-Chi like 2 weeks later, and we've never thought about it again. Because Shang can just do what he does better. And so that's kind of unfortunate for him, but at this point, short of an update, I think his time is pretty much past. So there you have it for skill. I do think it's a quite strong class these days. It definitely had its dark period there for a while, but it also has a more focused class identity than a lot of the others, and as a result of that, there's a lot of overlap in abilities and utility. And so I think it's somewhat disingenuous to try and identify truly essential skill champions other than perhaps Nick. After that, it's really more an issue of you trying to identify the core pieces of utility that the class has to offer and making sure that you have your bases covered, and as long as you do, your battle group should be successful. So I hope you found this helpful, and I will catch you next time for the last one, the mutant class. Take care.